I'd like to start with a question, and we're going to dialogue. The question is, when you think of a college campus, what comes to mind? So maybe 3 or 4 responses, just shout it out. First thing that comes to mind, college campus. Parties. Professors, parties, professors. Football. Lots of young adults. Lots of owing money. Liberal campus. Yeah, sometimes even Christian groups aren't allowed to do certain things. There can be restrictions. Anything else? Frat parties. It's true. At CWU, where we've been for the last 20 years, there are no frat parties because there's not a Greek system there. So we have, one blessing is we just have access to the whole campus. There's not a Greek system. I think there are lots of impressions that we can have about the college campus. And so that usually leads to this question, which should be up on the screen, which is why spend time to go physically onto the college campus? Like, why do we do that as campus missionaries? I'm going to let Becky take it here.
Hello. So one reason that we just think it's vital to go onto the college campus and reach students there is that we can become a visible community and witness of Jesus right in the heart of the campus culture. Chi Alpha is a community, a home on campus for students where we preach and teach and worship together. There should be a picture of our first Chi Alpha meeting at Central this fall. And about half the students there are newcomers this year. So it's a little bit like replanting a church on the campus every single year because students leave and graduate and you recruit new ones in every single year. Some of the students here are strong Christians who came to campus looking for Christian fellowship. Some of them don't know the first thing about faith in Christ. They just like the nice person down the hall who invited them to come to this meeting and came to learn. We work really hard on those first critical couple of weeks of the school year each year in the fall, where students show up on campus and there are a million things to be involved in, and they usually will say yes if you invite them to something. So we work hard to throw our nets wide in those first couple of weeks to meet as many students as possible. And whoever they connect with and their friendship circle in those first couple of weeks usually determine the trajectory of their college years. So we work hard then.
Here's a second reason. We go onto campus because we want to call students to make disciples, who make disciples. Pastor Jerry, I think you gave our message already about this, but basically we have a student leadership team. There's a couple of our students in this picture, and they are reaching out to the brand new freshmen, those who are nominal, not in the faith, or those who are currently following Jesus but need to be plugged in. There's a saying that I've heard often around our country in Chi Alpha, and that is responsibility, spiritual responsibility, is like miracle grow in a student's life. In other words, when you take one student and say, your job is to reach out to your roommate and bring them to the Bible study that meets down the hall. Your job is to meet one-on-one with this newcomer and open the Bible together and learn how to pray together. That is like miracle grow in someone's life. They actually start to discover that God is using them and calling them into ministry themselves right there on the campus. Students are the leaders and pastors in our ministry. Isn't that cool? We engage, we teach them how to ask questions, how to make friends, and how to reach others for Christ. Becky.
There should be a picture with a whole room full of lots of students. It might be, yes, there we go. This is our fall retreat. Winter retreat every year. Another reason to be on campus is that when students become a community of Christ on a campus, they follow the call of God and become a movement to the nations. Each year at our winter camp, which is our whole area here, Washington and Oregon and Northern Idaho, we're able to make an appeal for our Chi Alpha students to give a year to missions after they graduate from college and to pray about a lifetime. And we have so many students saying yes to this appeal, to this call, that we are scrambling to find places to connect with missionaries and places for them to go. We're praying and seeing a student awakening on our campuses. And this is a very interesting statistic that about half of the new missionaries in the Assemblies of God are coming from secular campuses these days. Half, because they landed in a Chi Alpha ministry, got incredible discipleship from students, began to see their own campus as their mission field to be reaching out to, and then asked God, God, where are you calling me for my next mission field following this?
So there is a photo here. We should go back one, and it's of a bunch of students that we've seen actually leave our ministry at Central and head elsewhere. And up in the top left and in the lower right, you see two guys in red. And one of the guys, lower right, I mentored here at Central about 15 years ago. And then he went out and before he left, he mentored another student at Central who then mentored another and then another and another. And so I'll tell that story a little bit later, but I want to point out that our goal is to reconcile students to Christ and equip them in this community of faith, community of prayer, community of worship, discipleship, and mission, so that they transform their university and they head out and they go to another place to do exactly the same thing.
And the next slide. Our mission with Chi Alpha is to reconcile students to Christ. Try another. This is our mission statement, equipping them through spirit-filled communities of prayer, worship, fellowship, discipleship, and mission to transform the university, the marketplace, and the world. We really pull that mission statement out of Acts 2, 42 through 47, which describes the early church as being a community of prayer, worship, fellowship, discipleship, and mission. And so here, you ask, where is Chi Alpha today? There's about a dozen campuses around the state and northern Idaho where we have Chi Alpha. We also have a new plant that's starting this fall at Green River College near Auburn. Dan and I have been in Ellensburg for 20 years, and we've been invested in Chi Alpha all of that time. God's been shifting our role a bit in the last 6 or so years, and we're now overseeing Chi Alpha in Washington, northern Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska. So we're overseeing Chi Alpha in those regions, and really the heart of our role is to have develop healthy Chi Alpha on more campuses in all those regions. So it's supporting and encouraging and training and equipping our Chi Alpha staff on all of those campuses and helping to be visionary and strategic in planting new Chi Alpha on new campuses.
I'd like to share a message for the rest of our time that has to do with, thank you. There's a lot of things that students go through in their life on campus. And one of the themes that our family, Becky and I, went through this summer was a theme out of the book of James, which I have found has been extremely powerful in discipling students. And so I'd like to share this with you so that you can kind of get a picture of the things that we might challenge students to do on campus, but is completely relevant in a place like this. And that is from the book of James, chapter 1. So if you wouldn't mind turning there for a few minutes. I want to start with this question. How do you think about challenging, hard, or painful experiences? Does God send hard labor and painful experiences our way? Does he send them to us? Or does he allow them to come our way for a reason? Do we have any business complaining about difficult things in life? Why or why not? I'm sure you've thought about that. You know, most of the time we sit down with a student one-on-one. You know, you typically sit down every single week and you sit down over lunch or something like that, and you walk them through the stages that they're in their life. For most college students, I'm sure this is true for most 20-something, it's what am I going to do with my life? And there's certain habits and things that are going on in their life that need some adjustment. And there's some healing that's needed from past experiences. Or you're asking them to step up in their commitment to Jesus, and that feels like a challenge to them as well. So how do we think about difficult experiences? I'd like us to read from James chapter 1. We'll read a whole bunch of verses 2 through 17 here. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. When you ask, you must not believe and doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plants, its blossom falls, and its beauty destroyed. In this same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood that test, that person will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own desire, evil desire, and enticed. Then, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth to the word of truth, so that we may be a kind of firstfruits of all he created. Again, let's talk for a moment. When you read this passage, what are some themes that stand out? So it's, say a theme in terms of a word or maybe a phrase. Let's hear 2 or 3. Being joyful. Trials are guaranteed. Some of them, yes, come directly from our own desires. Let's get one more. Yeah, God doesn't tempt us, cause us to sin. That's true. Here's another one. I think this says this several times. We only mature by going through hardship. Think about that for a second. In fact, you might want to write that down and then dwell on it for the next month. We only mature by going through hardship. Looking at where it says trials of many kinds, what are some examples of major life trials that are truly painful or burdensome or overwhelming? Now, when I ask this in a group, I typically get these kind of responses. Cancer, a need for major healing. Death, people suffering on the deathbed, months of trial in their life. Or social injustice, true in our country. Or being raped or stolen from. Or the house burning down. At a retreat with our Chi Alpha missionaries a couple months ago, one of them said, there are some things that we in America don't know how to relate to as well because they happen elsewhere. For example, your entire family being uprooted by violence in your country, having to migrate across country borders. That is a major life trial, truly painful, overwhelming. I think this is true for the 20-something person as well. We often talk about cancer and death and things of this nature that don't feel like they come down to the younger age. But at the same time, I think about, most students are trying to figure out what in the world am I going to do with my life, and have this sense of needing direction. And life is not easy. Life just doesn't hand you a job. And so there's some work that needs to be done. There was another student, Becky and I did some pre-engagement counseling with her and her now husband. And a couple years ago, when she was still single, Jessie, this gal, came to me and she said, "My mom is kicking me out of the house." And she's in a fit of rage, and she took the rest of the money out of my bank account, what I was going to use in order to pay for my first month's rent for college. And I don't have a place to stay, and I don't know if I'm going to make it to school. Now, that's a major trial. I mean, when your parent denies you, disowns you. Well, let me ask a different question then. What are some trials that are common to most people that we might perceive as burdensome, but in reality, they're not that big in the big picture? And when I ask that of a group, I'm sure you can think of a few too, but here's one. Life is really busy. I hardly have time to get caught up on the bills or to catch up on a relationship. Or I'm really short on sleep. I'm not getting enough sleep. Or the typical aches and pains and troubles and gastrointestinal problems and not having enough money in the bank. Or just the fact that it takes so much work to get your teenage kids all around town every other night. Or that the baby is crying every single night. You know, there are a lot of things that, in a sense, you could say we perceive them as big, but in the large picture, everybody goes through them. In the large picture, you could say, you know, it's actually not that big of a deal. There's people in a much worse circumstance. What does it mean to take joy in trials of every kind? Well, I want to try and answer that question today. That is, again, if you wrote this down and said, Lord, help me to answer this question, you might want to dwell on it for a month. Because taking joy in trials of every kind is not something that just readily comes to mind with quick answers. I do know that some trials in my life I formerly viewed as large, and it turned out later that today, if I were to go back and live through them again, I would say this isn't that big of a deal. Even things that were painful at times. And the way that I know that I would go back and live through it differently now is I've actually been through them, and I can see how they end up. And so that's actually one thing that does help us. You see how a trial actually ends up. Okay, this wasn't that big of a deal in the end. I have the skills. I discovered I had the skills as I went through it. I know I have the skills now. I could do it again. So mostly what has taught me to take joy in trials, large and small, has simply been the experience of having been through it before. Knowing the outcome, knowing the measure of my abilities. So think about some of the things in your life that you might say, this is hard. Oh, this is so hard. And think about some of them and say, well, let me just position myself 10 years from now. Actually, you don't even have to think about yourself being 10 years from now. Just go to somebody who's 10 years older and say, you know, is this possible to get through? And you'll probably get some good advice. But the second way that I've learned how to take joy in the midst of some truly painful times actually has been watching other people who chose joy, who had the spiritual discipline of choosing joy in the midst of truly painful times, overwhelming circumstances. And that was a refreshing thing for me to see somebody respond in a very different way than the rest of the people around me did to that kind of thing. So I want to make 3 points about what it means to take joy in trials of every kind. You might want to write these down. Number 1, these are really simple, but again, you want to think about them for a month. Number 1, God is not to blame. God is to thank for what he's doing. He is at work, but he's not to blame for the trial itself. And I think that was said by the lady in the back. God's not the one who, it says, he's not the one who tempts us. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. So you have to understand, in the context of a chapter like this, which is talking about trials of every kind and persevere through every trial, when you read the sentence, when tempted, no one should say God is tempting me, we know that that's not simply referring to sin temptation, but it's all other temptations, the temptation to think God's not present in your hard life right now. That's a temptation. And yet God is not the one to blame. He's not the one who's bringing that circumstance to us. It says, again there, don't be deceived. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who doesn't change. Or think about in Romans chapter 8, the chapter about the incomparable difference between our suffering and what God has for us. In Romans 8:18, it says, I consider our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Not even worth comparing. And later in 8:26 of Romans, he says, in the same way, the Holy Spirit helps us in our weakness. We don't know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And then we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. So you can say, God's not to blame, but in this moment, God is present working for the good. And in that, I can take joy. Second, God changes our attitude. That doesn't mean, when God changes your attitude about something, it doesn't mean that the trials aren't difficult, that you're not having a hard time. But it means that our attitude toward those trials is transformed. God changes the way we see them. We simply see past the present circumstance to see our Lord's goodness. If you'd like to see a scriptural example of what this looks like, you can look at about a quarter of all of the Psalms. So think about this one. This is Psalm 13, but this sounds exactly like many of the other Psalms. David, writing this poem, says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? There's a lot of Psalms like that. David starts out and is upset at God and says, where are you? And then the psalm shifts about halfway through. So in Psalm 13, he says, when he gets to the end of his wrestling, David says, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. And so I will sing for the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. That's a shift. It happens in so many of these Psalms where David says, isn't it amazing that the Lord has still been good to me, and so now I look to that. That word unfailing love, it's a phrase in English, but I trust in your unfailing love. That's a word in Hebrew called chesed. You say it right, you have to say it from the back of your throat. Chesed. It's a word describing love that persists, that is deep like a well. It remains. Oh, should we all? I see some smiles. Should we practice that together? Chesed. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Chesed. The steadfast love of God. The unfailing love of God. It's always translated in English in a way that has to add to the word love because we don't have the full idea of it in English. It doesn't stop. And that is what we can look to see our attitude change. A new attitude. Lord, I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. In the midst of this trial, I will sing your praise, for you have been good to me. My perspective is looking beyond now. Work and hardship and pain is just a circumstance right now. It is not a defining factor in my life. That's what we need to hear. And number 3, So one was God is not to blame, but he is to thank. Number two, God changes our attitude. We see past our trials to the Lord's goodness. And number three, God accomplishes a purpose in our trials. Now, I'm quoting a Christian author. In fact, let's see, in the announcements today, there was the toxic, how to walk away topic that was talked about. And so I think that that title that I heard was taken directly from a book that's out now, a brand new by Gary Thomas. Yep, it's his book study. And so Gary Thomas has a number of other books, especially about marriage and relationships. And one of the phrases he places in his book on marriage, which is called Sacred Marriage, is simply this: what if God's greatest purpose in our life is not to make us happy, but make us holy? And he's talking about marriage. You know, you get delightfully into a marriage, and then you discover it's not that easy. And so Gary Thomas asks, what if God's purpose in the marriage is not to make you happy, but to make you holy, to make you more like God, to help us grow into maturity? So let's look at that for a second. I especially think about this when James says right up front, consider it pure joy when you experience trials of every kind. Now, this doesn't say experience joy, but there's an adjective on it: experience pure joy. Pure joy, in my mind, means that we understand every challenge in life results in our edification. That's a long word that basically means it helps you to mature. Every trial in our life, every challenge results in our edification. So think about that for a second. When I ask this of students, Becky and I have done, this is an annual cycle, but we always talk about relationships and how to date well and how to choose a mate well, just because that's the phase of life that you're in when you're 18 to 24, which is our demographic. So we're always asking this question. And so I ask, how many meaningful friendships have you encountered here in college this year because you had a really easy time hanging out? But just say this is a very meaningful friendship to you. How many of you have one because it was easy hanging out? And the answer is, well, not really many of those at all. This relationship is meaningful because we have fought some fights together. We've worked alongside each other and gone through challenges together. We have even had conflict and then resolved our conflict and then been at a deeper stage of our relationship, a deeper level of trust because of what we went through together. How many deep transformations in your life have you experienced and then discovered on the other side that this relationship is so much more meaningful, or this experience was so much more meaningful? We grow by having to fight our way through hard experiences. And so James says, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord promised to those who love him. Perseverance leads to life. And again, going back to Romans chapter 8, so worth it. He says, for the creation itself was subjected to frustration. How many of you feel subjected to frustration at times? And so God says creation itself was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hopes that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. And so Gary Thomas would say you get married because you need to be liberated from your bondage to many poor habits of relating, and your self-centeredness, and being bonded with another forces you to deal with your self-centeredness until the Lord transforms it. And here, I think pure joy means we actually see that that process is transformative in our life. It's not just be happy in the midst of a trial. It says it is pure joy because we know that God is changing us to be like him. Pure joy means we will embrace the faith that our students, for us it's college students, that the faith of our children, so Becky and I have children, many of you have children, our neighbors and our family members and our coworkers, the faith of all of these people will not simply develop until we walk through challenges with them. So I'm applying it more broadly than just you. Think about the people around you and understand that the Lord is actually at work when somebody is going through some challenges, and it's our role to walk through those things with them. Just notice that whole progression in verse 3 to 4. Joy is our foundation. It's not a cover up, it's our beginning attitude. And then when we encounter trials of every kind, it's just our lot in life. It's a part of the process that God walks through with us. They're hardly to be concerned about, leading to perseverant character. And then spiritual maturity and wholeness, and then eventually the crown of life that the Lord has promised us. C.S. Lewis once wrote, this is in a famous book by C.S. Lewis. He wrote, "Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world." And I carry that verse with me a lot of the time when I'm walking on campus, because we are surrounded by students who are in many degrees of pain because family life at home, the kind of disruption of being dropped onto a campus and not knowing anybody and not knowing your future and being worried about if you're going to meet somebody that you can marry, and conflict that happens, and politics and the political world that happens not just around in our country but on the campus, all of those things. I think without this kind of pain, students would not call out for God. And therefore, we are here for them in this time to bring the presence of God. And I'd like you to consider applying that in your own life as well. And say, okay, Lord, if pain is a megaphone to rouse a deaf world, quoting C.S. Lewis, Lord, what should I call out for you now? Would you guide my prayer? Would you call me to action? What we learn from James is that for those who already believe, pain is just God's tool to make us more like him. And so I would like to close with a story, and you can put those slides back up. It's actually the slide that has the pictures of the students without the text across the top. I'd like to describe how this works in our life and how it can work in yours. I pointed to Derek, who's the lower right in the red sleeves. And this was 15 years ago. I sat down with Derek. I thought he was a freshman, but yesterday he told me he was a junior when this happened. So changing my story. He joined my Bible study. We met in a dormitory on campus. And it was the dormitory he lived in. And so for a year, I called him to start discipling the guys around him in that dormitory. And it came to the end of the year where he had an apartment and he was going to move off campus. And so I challenged him to take an important step of discipleship and to make sure that he replaced himself in this dormitory. Now, if you don't know the culture, basically when you're a freshman, you're required to live in the residence hall. And then when you're a sophomore, you say, I'm no longer required to live there, and so I'm going to move off campus. And we often challenge our students to stay, because if you're there and you're a sophomore, you're inherently a mentor to all these freshmen who move in the next year. And so there's a profound opportunity. It's just like fishing, and you're always catching somebody in the residence hall. So Derek took up this challenge, and he helped a freshman in that hall named Jason to get serious about Jesus. And Derek eventually graduated and went to the University of Idaho to do campus ministry. But that student, Jason, lived the next year in this residence hall. And he led a Bible study in that dorm that year as well. And he helped a freshman named Matt come to know Jesus. By the end of the year, Matt was saying, I want to do what you're doing. So I've signed up to live in this dorm next year. And Jason moved out, but Matt stayed. And the next year, Matt met a number of other students, including a student named Drew, and he challenged Drew to live in that residence hall the next year. And never mind all these names, are you seeing a pattern here? One of the things we've done is to challenge students to do the unexpected. It's cheaper to live off campus. You can choose your friends. You can eat the food that you want to eat. There's lots of advantages to living off campus. And it's really a step of faith to say, okay, I will stay on campus. And it's noisy until 2 a.m. depending on the dorm you live in, and so it's harder to sleep, and sometimes it's messy in the bathrooms, and there's lots of reasons why a student would say this is a hardship. But at the same time, they are walking through a life with other students who are there walking through the same hardship, which means they are calling out for help. They are calling on the name of the Lord without even knowing it sometimes. And so when you choose to stay there, you're choosing to be an evangelist and to be a community builder, to bring the community of Jesus in the college dorm. Well, this one guy, Drew, who stayed the next year, he decided to stay after we challenged him to do that. But when he came back and he said, yes, I've decided to do it. He said, I've also recruited 5 other Chi Alpha students to do it with me. So we are all going to live in the residence hall together, and we're going to call it our mission field. And so Drew, every single week, had this gathering of the 5, I guess we would call them student missionaries, and they would pray for the residence hall. They'd talk about who are we inviting to Bible study, who are we inviting to the Chi Alpha worship gathering. And there were often 20 students in this long train following Drew and his roommate to come to some of our Chi Alpha events and our worship meetings. It was powerful. Drew is now a missionary in North Africa, working alongside a church planting team. If I go back one generation to Matt, well, Matt did our Chi Alpha internship and spent 2 years reaching students on campus after he graduated. I go back before that, Jason, second student in the line, Jason is now reaching international students up at Skagit Valley College near Bellingham. I go back before that, there's Derek, and Derek is right there, of course, at the University of Idaho. And so finally, when you get down this line to Drew and then another student named Jared and then another student named Christian, I met with this student, Christian. We wrestled through a lot of major challenges in his life, and he eventually had some major healings that happened in his life. And then he met his wife. She did the Chi Alpha internship, and then they ended up at the University of Idaho. And so she is in the lower left corner taking the selfie. You can tell who's always taking the selfie because their face is really big in the picture. And Christian is the top left in the red. And so I have yet to tell Derek that Christian is his great, great, great grandson spiritually in the Lord. But that is such a powerful story about what sacrifice leads to when you have intentional discipleship in a place where people are hurting. And so that's what we do. Becky and I hadn't figured out how we were going to end, and so we weren't quite certain how this transition was going to happen. So I do want to let you know that we are committed to discipling students from our campus to other campuses around our entire region. And not only that, but there's a percentage of our students that actually go overseas and are reaching college students across the oceans in other places, including the one, Drew, that I was just talking about. And so that is more or less our life calling right now, and we are delighted to do it and delighted to help see God's kingdom come in a broader way to people who are unreached. We do want to thank you for being a part of that story. The Central Assembly has been a part of our story, our support team for 15 plus years, and we're deeply grateful for that. If you would like to pray for us, and I think there's a slide at the very end that might say, will you pray for Chi Alpha students today? If you'd like to pray for us, we do need people who will pray for this mission. And so I will have a computer out on the table back there, and you can put down an email and an address so we have a mixture of email and paper letters. But about once a month, we have some prayer requests for what's going on campus, and we would love to have a few more people join us in that.